October 25, 1944, Philippine Sea, east of Samar Island. High above the pale gray expanse of the Philippine Sea, Enan William Brooks gripped the controls of his Grumman TBF Avenger, the tension in his hands betraying the calm exterior required of a pilot on routine patrol. At 1,500 feet, he scanned the horizon with binoculars, relaying urgent observations over the radio. What he was seeing challenged every intelligence report and assumption about Japanese fleet movements. Dark silhouettes of pagoda-style masts emerged through the early morning mist. Among them, the unmistakable outline of Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, cut through patches of fog. Surrounding it, an entire assembly of heavy cruisers and additional battleships advanced at full speed. Below them, 6 lightly armed American escort carriers and a handful of destroyers, part of Task Unit 7743, remained dangerously exposed. Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague, in command of the task unit, had been reassured that Admiral William F. Halsey's powerful Third Fleet safeguarded the northern approach. Intelligence suggested that the San Bernardino Strait between Luzon and Samar was controlled by American capital ships. Yet, at precisely 637 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force appeared through the haze, confronting a force it dramatically outclassed. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers poised against 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The tactical balance of the situation defied conventional naval calculations. Decisions made in the next minute would determine survival or annihilation. In the unfolding chaos, a daring plan emerged. Small destroyers and escort vessels would engage the Japanese battleships directly, a seemingly suicidal maneuver whose potential success would enter the annals of naval history. The events of this morning were the culmination of months of American advance across the Pacific. By late October 1944, the liberation of the Philippines was unavoidable. American forces had landed on Leyte Island on October 20, threatening Japan's critical supply lines for oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Southeast Asia. Without these vital resources, Japan's war machinery faced eventual paralysis. Recognizing the existential danger, the Imperial Japanese Navy formulated a complex counteroffensive, Operation Shogo 1 or Victory Operation 1. This plan relied on the coordination of 3 distinct task groups, each approaching from different directions to converge on the American invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. The Northern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, moved southward from Japan with 4 aircraft carriers. These vessels, however, were significantly depleted in both airframes and experienced pilots, barely fielding 100 aircraft in total. The northern carriers served a sacrificial role, meant to draw Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf and create an opening for the main strike elsewhere. From the south, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's contingent navigated through Surigao Strait. Composed of 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, supported by the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers. Their mission was a direct assault on the invasion fleet from below. The centerpiece of the operation, the center force, was led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. This formidable assembly was directed through the San Bernardino Strait to engage the vulnerable transports directly. Representing the strongest concentration of Japan's remaining naval power after years of attrition, the center force was a potent mixture of battleships and cruisers capable of wreaking unprecedented destruction. At its heart sailed Yamato, a floating fortress displacing 800 tons and armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever installed on a warship. Each gun could hurl a 3,220-pound shell over 26 miles with remarkable precision. Musashi, its sister ship, accompanied it, equally formidable and untested in combat. Additional firepower came from battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, whose 14 and 16-inch guns added to the overwhelming weight of the Japanese formation. As the morning unfolded, the stage was set for one of the most audacious naval confrontations in history, where sheer determination, ingenuity, and bravery would meet the raw destructive capacity of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The decisions made in these critical moments would determine the fate of countless lives and the trajectory of the Pacific War. A formidable Japanese surface fleet, consisting of 10 heavy cruisers, wielded significant mid-range firepower capable of threatening almost any Allied vessel short of a battleship. The group included the heavy cruisers Takayo, Maya, Chokai, Miyoko, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, Tone, Chikuma, and the flagship Atago, each mounting 8 to 10 8-inch guns. Their heavy ordnance made them a substantial threat in any surface engagement. 2 light cruisers, Noshiro and Yahagi, provided screening and defensive fire with rapid-firing 6-inch guns, while 11 destroyers completed the formation, offering both anti-submarine and close-range offensive capabilities. Strategically, Operation Shogo 1 appeared sound on paper, yet US submarines had already begun undermining the plan before it could fully unfold. On October 23, US submarines USS Data and USS Dace were patrolling the Palawan Passage west of the Philippines. Their sonar operators soon detected the movement of Kurita's fleet advancing toward Leyte. Commanders David McClintock aboard Data and Bladen Claggett aboard Dace executed a coordinated torpedo strike with remarkable precision. At dawn, Data fired torpedoes that struck the heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship, causing catastrophic explosions. The cruiser sank within minutes, taking approximately 360 crewmen with her. Vice Admiral Kurita narrowly escaped by abandoning the vessel and swimming through shark-infested waters before being rescued by the destroyer Kishinami. The trauma of witnessing his flagship destroyed around him had a lasting effect on Kurita's judgment during the subsequent engagement off Samar. Data's second salvo hit the heavy cruiser Takao, severing her stern and flooding vital engineering spaces. Though Takao survived, she was severely damaged and forced to retreat toward Brunei under escort, removing a critical component from Kurita's strike force. Meanwhile, Dace targeted the heavy cruiser Maya, resulting in a massive explosion that sank the vessel within minutes. Within a single hour, American submarines had destroyed 2 heavy cruisers, crippled a third, and directly imperiled the Japanese fleet commander, significantly weakening the operational strength of the Japanese center force. Despite these setbacks, Kurita transferred his command to the super battleship Yamato and continued eastward, as the original timetable demanded his presence at Leyte Gulf by dawn on October 25. There was no opportunity to regroup or adjust the plan. The following day, October 24, brought a series of devastating attacks from U.S. carrier aircraft assigned to Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. As Kurita's fleet navigated the Sibuyan Sea, dive bombers and torpedo planes launched repeated assaults throughout the afternoon. The super battleship Musashi became the primary target. Over a period of 4 hours, she absorbed an extraordinary volume of ordnance, enduring what would have sunk almost any other capital ship. American pilots claimed a total of 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits on Musashi, though Japanese records suggest 11 torpedoes and 10 bombs actually struck the vessel. Regardless of the exact figures, the outcome was unequivocal. By 1935 hours, Musashi capsized and sank, resulting in the loss of over 1,000 crewmen. Her sister ship, Yamato, continued toward Leyte, but would arrive the next morning without her consort. The heavy tow suffered in the Sibuyan Sea forced Kurita to briefly reverse course around 15:00 hours, appearing to withdraw. U.S. reconnaissance reported the Japanese center force heavily damaged and retreating, which shaped the subsequent operational decisions of Admiral Halsey. While aboard his flagship USS New Jersey, Halsey interpreted these reports as an opportunity. That evening, he received additional intelligence that the Japanese carrier force under Ozawa was advancing from the north. Recognizing the chance to decisively engage Japan's remaining carriers' key instruments that had previously determined battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and the strikes on Rabaul, Halsey made the critical decision to pursue them. He took his entire Third Fleet northward at maximum speed, including 6 fast battleships and 8 fleet carriers with their escorts, leaving the northern flank of Leyte Gulf exposed to the approaching Japanese surface forces. No naval forces were stationed to defend the San Bernardino Strait. More importantly, the decision to leave it undefended was not explicitly conveyed to Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid, who commanded the 7th Fleet and was tasked with safeguarding the Leyte invasion area. Earlier, Rear Admiral Ralph A. Holley had issued a preparatory message regarding the creation of Task Force 34, a heavily armed battleship contingent under Admiral Willis Lee intended to cover the strait. However, this directive was purely a precautionary measure and never transformed into an actionable order. Misinterpretations and assumptions led Kinkaid to believe that Task Force 34 had already been dispatched to the strait. Admiral Chester Nimitz, stationed at Pearl Harbor, received the same communications and drew an identical conclusion. In reality, no such fleet existed, leaving the San Bernardino Strait entirely exposed. After reorganizing his battered fleet following the loss of the Musashi, Vice Admiral Kurita reversed course after nightfall and advanced eastward. By 35 on October 25, his forces traversed the strait without encountering any opposition. Not a single American vessel or aircraft observed the passage. Kurita's center force, though reduced in size, remained a formidable threat. It included 4 battleships with the Yamato at the forefront, accompanied by 6 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, and Tone. 2 light cruisers, Noshiro and Yahagi, and 11 destroyers completed the group. This powerful formation was now moving south along the eastern coastline of Samar Island toward the American landing zones, which were virtually undefended. Between Kurita's heavily armed fleet and General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 troops on the beaches, the only opposition consisted of 3 small units of escort carriers. These escort carriers, identified over radio as Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, were designed for air support and anti-submarine patrols rather than surface combat. Converted from merchant ship hulls at the Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, they were lightly armed, unarmored, and relatively slow. Their defensive armament consisted of a single 5-inch gun and multiple 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft weapons. Aircraft on board carried bombs and rockets intended for land targets, lacking armor-piercing capabilities required for engaging battleships. The carrier's maximum speed was about 18 knots, only slightly faster than standard merchant vessels, while Japanese cruisers could sustain speeds of 30 knots, ensuring that the enemy could close the distance rapidly despite any evasive maneuvers. Taffy 3, positioned furthest north and nearest to the San Bernardino Strait, was under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, known among his peers as Ziggy to distinguish him from Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague, who led Taffy 2 some 190 miles to the south. Ziggy Sprague's command comprised 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers, each displacing roughly 7,800 tons, totaling approximately 50,000 tons. USS Fanshawe Bay 70 served as the flagship, supported by USS St. Lo, CVE-63, USS White Plains, CVE-66, USS Kitten Bay, CVE-71, USS Kinnan Bay, CV-8, and USS Gambia Bay, CVE-73. Each carrier carried about 28 aircraft, a mix of FM-2 Wildcats, improved iterations of the older 4F and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. In total, Taffy 3 fielded around 165 planes, roughly equivalent in quantity to 2 fleet carriers, though most pilots were trained primarily for close air support rather than naval warfare. The carrier group was escorted by 7 small warships, affectionately called the Small Boys by their crews in recognition of their modest size and unsung duties. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers delivered the main surface firepower: USS Johnston, DD-557, USS Hoel, DD-533, and USS Hoel, DD-532. Each displaced 2,100 tons, fully loaded and mounted 5 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets, capable of firing 54-pound shells up to 18,000 yards under optimal conditions. They were also equipped with 10 21-inch torpedo tubes arranged in 2 quintuple mounts, firing Mark 15 torpedoes with 825-pound warheads at speeds of 46 knots over distances up to 10,000 yards. Supporting them were 4 John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts: USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE-413, USS Dennis, DE-405, USS John C. Butler, DE-339, and USS Raymond, DE-341. These ships displaced only 1,350 tons each, mounted 2 5-inch guns, and lacked the sophisticated fire control systems of larger destroyers. Their torpedo armament was minimal, suitable mainly for anti-submarine operations rather than confronting a major surface fleet. These compact warships were engineered primarily for convoy protection and anti-submarine duties. They were never intended to face heavily armored battleships in direct combat. The enemy's belt armor alone exceeded the entire hull thickness of these destroyer-class escorts. At 6:37 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Ensign William C. Brooks, conducting his routine anti-submarine patrol, observed an unusual naval formation approaching from the north. The early morning sky over the tropical waters was a murky mix of yellow-gray, punctuated by scattered clouds at roughly 1,500 feet, with visibility around 20 miles, though occasionally broken by passing rain squalls. Brooks had taken off from St. Lo at 6:05 a.m., tasked with patrolling a sector 20 miles north and west of Taffy 3, keeping an eye out for submarines and reporting any irregularities. What he spotted was far from ordinary. Adjusting his altitude to investigate, Brooks radioed his initial sighting. At a bearing of 240 degrees, he estimated 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers advancing toward Taffy 3. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague received the report on Fanshawe Bay's flag bridge with skepticism bordering on frustration. He suspected a misidentification, imagining a young aviator mistaking friendly ships for enemy vessels. Task Force 34, commanded by Admiral Halsey, was supposed to be guarding the San Bernardino Strait far from this location. Sprague instructed Brooks to double-check his observation. 3 minutes later, at 6:40, Brooks confirmed the presence of enemy forces with chilling clarity. The unmistakable pagoda-style superstructures revealed that these were Japanese battleships, including the colossal Yamato, flying the largest visible meatball flag. Their course was directly toward the vulnerable escort carriers of Taffy 3, and they were moving quickly. By 6:45 a.m., lookouts on the carriers noticed anti-aircraft fire erupting on the northwestern horizon as the Japanese ships targeted Brooks' lone aircraft. Moments later, shell splashes began appearing near the American vessels. The Japanese employed colored dye in their shells to help spotters identify which projectiles were hitting. Red, green, yellow, and blue splashes marched steadily toward the carriers, producing a terrifyingly vivid spectacle, a deadly rainbow across the ocean. Each shell, weighing hundreds of pounds, detonated violently upon contact with the water, forming brilliant yet lethal fountains. At 6:46, Yamato unleashed her first long-range salvo. Its 9 18.1-inch guns hurled more than 9 tons of steel and explosives toward the small American fleet. Sprague faced an almost hopeless tactical scenario. His carriers could not outrun the Japanese ships, even if engines were pushed to the limit, gaining 1 extra knot beyond their designed 18 knots. The escort vessel's 5-inch guns were incapable of breaching battleship or cruiser armor. Destroyer armaments could damage enemy superstructures but could not sink capital ships. The available aircraft were equipped for ground support, armed primarily with general-purpose bombs and rockets rather than armor-piercing ordnance. The torpedo bombers carried Mark 13 aerial torpedoes, but most had already been expended in pre-dawn strikes on shore targets. The nearest American heavy units capable of opposing the Japanese fleet were part of Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's bombardment group, located 90 miles to the south. These battleships had just concluded a night engagement against a Japanese southern force at Surigao Strait, depleting much of their armor-piercing ammunition and unable to reach Samar quickly. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, pursuing Japanese carrier forces to the north, would require at least 6 hours to arrive even if ordered back immediately, with perhaps only 15 minutes before enemy shells would start systematically dismantling his carriers. Sprague acted decisively. He ordered all available aircraft to launch without delay. Pilots sprinted to planes, some still in sleepwear or casual attire. Engines started even as pre-flight checks remained incomplete, and aircraft departed with whatever ordnance was on hand. Depth charges, general-purpose bombs, or in some cases empty wings, intending to divert enemy attention rather than inflict damage. Simultaneously, Sprague maneuvered his formation east-southeast. heading toward a rain squall detected by his radar operator roughly 5 miles ahead. This partial weather cover would obscure the ships, buying critical minutes in the desperate engagement to come. Thirdly, Sprague instructed his vessels to push their maximum operational speed. Engineering teams strained the boilers well beyond their intended capacities, coaxing every last rotation from turbines that were never engineered for prolonged high-speed engagement. In parallel, Sprague directed the escort ships to deploy smokescreens. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were equipped with chemical smoke generators capable of producing dense, artificial fog, which, combined with the black smoke emitted from the overheated carrier funnels, formed a thick visual barrier. This obstruction was intended to confuse Japanese optical range-finding instruments and hinder accurate targeting. At 6:50, Sprague broadcast a completely unencrypted message across all radio frequencies. Under assault by a Japanese cruiser group consisting of 4 battleships and 7 cruisers at 11 GAC 46 Nen, 126 Dakuni E, requesting immediate support. The transmission, flagrantly breaching standard radio protocols, was intercepted by every U.S. naval unit stationed throughout the Philippines, sparking widespread alarm in multiple command centers. Admiral Kincaid, who was still engaged with the remnants of the Southern Task Force, grasped the severity of the situation. The northern maritime approach was entirely undefended by heavy American ships. Admiral Halsey, positioned roughly 300 meters north of Cape Eno and actively engaging Ozawa's carriers, also received Sprague's distress call. The news was met with simultaneous dread and the knowledge that reinforcements would take hours to arrive. For Taffy 3, however, every minute was critical. By 7:01, Japanese shells began impacting the carrier formation. The intensity and scale of the bombardment were unprecedented for crews accustomed to close air support and anti-submarine missions. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns launched projectiles weighing over 3,200 pounds each, shell surpassing the weight of a small automobile. Heavy cruisers added to the assault with 8-inch shells, each 260 pounds, designed specifically to devastate lightly armored vessels such as escort carriers. Battleship Congo's 14-inch artillery further compounded the assault. The carrier's thin steel hulls, in many areas just fractions of an inch thick, offered virtually no protection. A single large-caliber strike could obliterate a ship from bow to stern, and multiple impacts could sink one within minutes. American vessels responded with frenzied zigzag maneuvers, a tactic known as chasing splashes. Ship officers tracked incoming shell splashes and immediately adjusted course to intersect them, hoping that Japanese gunners would not target the same area twice. Remarkably, this improvisational strategy frequently prevented direct hits. Japanese gunners, trained to aim at steadily moving targets, struggled to compensate for the constantly shifting American ships. Nonetheless, some shells did find their marks. The escort carrier White Plains was pierced by an armor-piercing round that passed entirely through the ship without detonating. Kainan Bay sustained multiple near misses, sending towering plumes of water across the flight deck and temporarily jamming her rudder. A sudden rain squall at 7:06 brought a brief reprieve, reducing visibility to under 1,000 yards and forcing Japanese gunners to pause their bombardment. During these 10 crucial minutes, the American crew organized damage control teams, prepared stations for abandoned posts, and offered silent prayers. Despite anticipating the likelihood of death, the men remained at their posts, resolved to resist to the last. As Taffy 3 emerged from the storm at 7:16, the tactical picture had deteriorated. Kurita's faster Japanese force had closed the distance significantly. Splashes from enemy fire now erupted around the carriers with alarming precision, and near misses hurled shrapnel across flight decks. Direct hits were imminent. At this critical juncture, Sprague made a decisive move that would define the engagement and preserve the remaining carriers. He ordered the destroyers to launch a torpedo assault against the Japanese formation. In fact, Commander Ernest E. Evans aboard USS Johnston had already initiated an attack before receiving Sprague's directive. At 7:10, 6 minutes prior to Sprague's order, Evans had independently turned Johnston northward and commenced a high-speed assault on the enemy. A Cherokee and Creek Indian from Oklahoma, Evans embodied the fearlessness and audacity that earned him the nickname the Chief among his crew. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony on October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year and 2 days prior to the Battle of Samar, Evans delivered a speech to his assembled sailors, words that would later attain legendary status. The vessel was explicitly prepared for combat. Its commanding officer made it clear. Any crew member unwilling to face extreme danger was free to leave immediately. Remarkably, not a single sailor sought reassignment. Over the preceding year, Evans had rigorously drilled Johnston's crew, pushing them to a level of proficiency where complex operations became almost automatic. Daily gunnery exercises honed precision under pressure. Teams responsible for damage control practiced tirelessly, ensuring rapid, coordinated responses to any emergency. Every officer and enlisted sailor received training on multiple stations, creating a highly versatile crew capable of adapting instantly in battle. Once the preparations were complete, Evans steered the ship directly toward the center of the Japanese formation and ordered maximum speed. Johnston's turbines roared as she accelerated beyond 35 knots, racing toward adversaries that outclassed her in size by roughly 50-fold. The initial distance between Johnston and her targets was approximately 35,000 yards, more than 17 nautical miles. Her Mark 15 torpedoes had an effective range of only about 10,000 yards, just under 6 miles. To deliver an effective strike, Evans would have to navigate through this immense distance under concentrated enemy fire to reach point-blank range. As the destroyer advanced, her crew deployed chemical smoke to form a dense artificial haze. This reduced visibility for enemy optical rangefinders, though it could not shield the ship from incoming shells. At 7:07, Johnston opened fire on the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano using her 5.5-inch guns at the maximum operational range. The ship's Mark 37 fire control system, integrated with a Mark 1A analog computer, provided a crucial advantage: continuously updated firing solutions, allowing Johnston to strike with high accuracy even under challenging conditions. Japanese gunners struggled with poor visibility caused by smoke, rain, and rapidly changing distances, while Johnston's radar systems maintained an uninterrupted feed of precise targeting information. Over the next 10 minutes, the destroyer launched more than 200 rounds. Despite the main belt of Kumano 4 to 5 inches of hardened steel protecting critical sections, Johnston's shells devastated the cruiser's superstructure and upperworks, where thinner armor and flammable materials created pronounced vulnerabilities. At least 45 rounds impacted Kumano, igniting multiple fires and crippling command centers, including the bridge and fire control stations. The upper decks became a chaotic scene of explosions and burning debris. Communications were disrupted, and the cruiser's ability to coordinate defensive or offensive actions was severely impaired. Though her engines and main battery remained functional, the damage significantly reduced her operational effectiveness. By 7:20, Johnston had close to 10,300 yards and launched her full complement of 10 torpedoes. Traveling at 46 knots, the torpedoes left glowing wakes in their path. At least one, possibly two, struck Kumano's bow, obliterating the forward section and flooding compartments. The cruiser's speed immediately dropped to 8 knots, and she was forced to withdraw from the engagement, escorted by Suzuya, another heavy cruiser assigned to protect the crippled vessel. A smaller destroyer had effectively neutralized a major enemy unit at a critical moment in the battle. This success, however, came at a heavy cost. At 7:30, as Johnston maneuvered behind her own smokescreen, the battleship Yamato opened fire, mistakenly identifying Johnston as a much larger vessel due to the aggressive attack on Kumano and the visible destruction caused. From over 9 nautical miles away, optical rangefinders located Johnston with deadly precision. Yamato's 9.18.1-inch shells struck the destroyer almost simultaneously. The first shell hit the aft section below the waterline, penetrating Johnston's lightly armored hull as easily as a rifle bullet would pierce paper. The resulting explosion destroyed the after engine room, rupturing steam lines and flooding adjacent compartments. Escaping pressurized steam reached temperatures near 600 dpf, instantly killing personnel in the engine room. The second shell struck midship, obliterating the aft engine and cutting power to the rear portion of the ship, causing speed to drop from 35 to 17 knots. A third round struck 2/3 along the ship's length, disabling 3 of the 5 5-inch gun turrets, leaving only the 2 forward mounts functional. Each of Yamato's shells carried more than 3,200 pounds of weight and 73 pounds of explosive, designed to penetrate 16 inches of armor before detonating. Against Johnston's thin hull, the shells passed through before their fuses triggered, sparing the vessel from immediate destruction but causing catastrophic structural and operational damage. The aft 2/3 of the ship became a tangled, flooded wreck, with the vessel's combat capability severely compromised. Despite the devastating counterattack, Johnston's initial operation demonstrated the effectiveness of precise training, aggressive tactics, and technological advantage. A 200-ton destroyer had neutralized a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser in a confrontation that would have seemed improbable to most naval strategists. The mission underscored both the potential of small, well-coordinated forces and the lethal power of battleship artillery. During the engagement, Yamato's secondary battery, consisting of 6.1-inch guns, fired in unison alongside her primary armament. 3 155mm shells struck USS Johnston with catastrophic impact. One shell impacted amidships, destroying an anti-aircraft fire control station and instantly killing its operators. 2 additional shells hit the forward section, obliterating the torpedo director and shattering the bridge. The blast reduced the command center to a chaotic mix of twisted metal and human casualties. Commander Evans was thrown off his feet by the explosion. A steel fragment severed 2 fingers on his left hand, while the force tore his uniform from his body and peppered his chest and face with shrapnel. A large portion of the bridge crew perished immediately. Lieutenant Ed DeGardi, the navigator, lost part of his left hand to flying fragments, and although the helmsman was wounded, he maintained his post, relying on training and instinct. The quartermaster stationed at his duty was killed, leaving the scene drenched in blood on what remained of the bridge. With 3 of her main gun turrets out of commission, steering systems disabled, engines heavily damaged, and half the bridge team incapacitated, Johnston should have been rendered inoperable according to standard naval doctrine. Yet, Evans' leadership and his crew's rigorous training defied expectation. Damage control teams swiftly restored electricity to the 2 forward turrets using emergency cabling and re-established rudder control at the aft emergency station. Despite severe injuries and significant blood loss, Evans refused more than minimal first aid, instructing the ship's medical officer to conserve supplies for others in greater need. Relocating command to the fantail, Evans issued steering directions directly to sailors, manually turning the rudder, compensating for lost hydraulic assistance. Johnston, reduced to a speed of 17 knots with only 2 of 5 guns operational, remained in combat due entirely to the determination of her crew and the resolve of their captain. Over the following 2 hours, the ship continued engaging enemy targets until Japanese fire finally sank her. At the same time, USS Hoel and USS Herman initiated torpedo attacks, followed closely by 4 destroyer escorts, creating disarray in the Japanese formation. Kurita's vessels had maintained a cruising formation optimized for speed and mutual support, not for close-quarters maneuvering under attack. The aggressive American assaults forced the Japanese ships to maneuver independently to evade torpedoes, disrupting their coordinated firing plans and causing command confusion. Japanese commanders had anticipated overwhelming the U.S. carriers with sheer firepower, but instead found themselves dodging torpedoes, avoiding collisions, and losing situational awareness amid smoke and rain. USS Hoel, under Commander Leon S. Kindberger, aggressively advanced toward the Japanese battleships at the center of the formation. At 743, Hull launched a partial salvo of 5 torpedoes at battleship Congo from a distance of 9,000 yards. Congo turned sharply to starboard, evading the spread by presenting her narrow bow, which allowed the torpedoes to pass harmlessly along her hull. The evasive maneuver temporarily halted Congo's firing and displaced her from her position in the formation. At 754, Hull launched her remaining torpedoes at heavy cruiser Hargrove from under 6,000 yards, an exceptionally close range for naval combat. At least one torpedo struck Haguro's engineering compartment, causing flooding and slowing the cruiser while damage control efforts were made. Hull, however, suffered devastating counterfire over the next 45 minutes, absorbing more than 40 hits from battleship and cruiser artillery. Her bridge was destroyed by an 8-inch shell, killing most officers stationed there. The forward engine room flooded, the No. 2 gun mount was obliterated, and all steering control was lost, requiring emergency aft steering. Complete power loss occurred when the remaining engine room flooded at 830. With the ship immobile, severely listing and sinking, Kintberger ordered the crew to abandon ship. Hull went down stern first, taking 187 of her 273 officers and men, leaving only 86 survivors who spent up to 2 days in the water awaiting rescue. USS Herman, commanded by Commander Ernest T. Hathaway, executed one of the boldest maneuvers of the battle. At 754, she launched a full torpedo spread at battleship Haruna from just 4,400 yards, narrowly missing but forcing the enemy ship to turn away from the carriers, temporarily neutralizing her gunnery threat. Immediately afterward, Herman found herself caught between two advancing columns of Japanese heavy cruisers. Displaying exceptional courage and seamanship, Hathaway maneuvered Herman directly between battleship Congo and cruiser Chikuma, crossing the bows of both ships at extremely close range, performing a reverse cross-the-T maneuver with remarkable precision. When an American destroyer suddenly appeared between the Japanese vessels at distances under 5,000 yards, the enemy ships were forced into abrupt evasive maneuvers to prevent a collision. In the chaos of their sharp turns, the ships obscured each other's lines of fire and momentarily lost track of the destroyer Herman. Despite suffering several near misses, Herman avoided direct hits and managed to slip from the trap. Her bold engagement forced two of the Japanese heavy units to abandon their pursuit of the carriers, disrupting their formation at a crucial point in the battle. Throughout the engagement, Herman continued targeting any enemy vessel within reach. Her 5-inch guns struck multiple cruisers, though the damage inflicted on their armored hulls was relatively minor. Following initial hesitation, the 4 destroyer escorts vessels originally designed for anti-submarine operations rather than surface combat eventually joined the fray behind the larger destroyers. At 742, Rear Admiral Sprague issued orders for the Little Wolves, the radio designation for the escort group, to engage. The instructions were somewhat unclear, leaving the escort commanders uncertain whether to coordinate with the destroyer's assault or to launch independent attacks. After several minutes of indecision, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland of USS Samuel B. Roberts chose not to wait for further clarification. He directed his ship to follow the destroyers into combat without hesitation. Samuel B. Roberts was the smallest of the escorts, displacing only 1,350 tons, fully loaded, roughly the size of a World War I-era destroyer. Copeland pushed the ship well beyond her intended limits, driving the boilers to 660 pounds per square inch, far above the rated 440 CS. The engineering crew maintained this extreme pressure for more than an hour, risking catastrophic failure while extracting 28.7 knots from a vessel designed for a maximum of 24. Black smoke poured from the stack as the machinery strained under the extraordinary load. Before leading his ship into action, Copeland addressed his crew over the ship's public address system, delivering words that would later be remembered in Navy history. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds, with survival unlikely. We will do as much damage as we can." The statement was blunt, lacking dramatization, simply acknowledging the grim reality every sailor aboard already understood. They were heading directly toward heavily armed cruisers in a ship designed to combat submarines with almost no hope of surviving the engagement. Yet the mission was clear: protect the carriers at all costs. At 810, Samuel B. Roberts launched her 3 Mark 15 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Chokai from roughly 4,000 yards. The proximity allowed the destroyer's 40mm and 20mm guns to target Chokai's superstructure directly, inflicting casualties and destroying exposed equipment. torpedo hit the cruiser's stern engineering spaces, causing catastrophic damage to her propulsion system. Minutes later, a 500-pound bomb from a Taffy 2 aircraft detonated in Chokai's engine room, compounding the damage and leaving the cruiser immobile with uncontrollable flooding. The destroyer Fujin Army eventually sank the crippled vessel with torpedoes. In this remarkable feat, Samuel B. Roberts, a ship never intended for such a role, effectively neutralized a heavily armed cruiser. Following this success, Roberts engaged another heavy cruiser, Chikuma, in a prolonged gun battle at distances varying between 5,000 and 7,000 yards. Over the course of 35 minutes, her two 5-inch guns fired 608 rounds, maintaining an extraordinary sustained rate of over 17 rounds per minute per gun, remarkable for manually loaded weapons. Gun crews worked with mechanical precision, loading and firing continuously under heavy fire from Japanese shells. One gun mount, designated Mount 52, was operated by 24-year-old gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr from Chakakota, Oklahoma. Despite losing electrical power, Carr and his crew continued to operate the mount manually, loading each 54-pound shell by hand. Around 850, an 8-inch shell struck Mount 52, breaching the gun shield and killing or wounding most of the crew. Yet the gun remained operational, and Carr, grievously injured, refused to abandon his post, keeping the weapon firing. Tragedy struck moments later when a powder charge detonated prematurely due to the heat of the breach, destroying the mount and causing catastrophic injuries to Carr. Witnesses described his wounds as extending from neck to groin. Even as he lay dying, Carr held the final shell in the mount, urging anyone nearby to continue firing. He succumbed shortly thereafter. For his extraordinary courage and unwavering dedication, Carr was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. The USS Carr, FFG 52, a frigate of the Oliver Hazard Perry class, was commissioned in 1985 and named in honor of the distinguished officer. During the battle, at 8:51, the USS Samuel B. Roberts suffered a catastrophic strike when an 8-inch shell from the Japanese cruiser Chikuma penetrated the vessel below the waterline, detonating in the forward engine compartment. The explosion instantly transformed the engine room into a lethal trap. The space was densely packed with high-pressure steam pipes, fuel conduits, and heavy machinery. The blast ruptured all these systems simultaneously, releasing scalding steam and igniting fuel oil, producing a raging inferno. Seawater poured into the breach in the hull, accelerating the flooding. Most sailors stationed in the engine room were killed almost immediately. The main propulsion engines and electrical generators were rendered inoperative, leaving the ship powerless and rapidly sinking. At 9:09, a second shell impacted near the aft 5-inch gun mount, inflicting additional casualties. 1 minute later, with the vessel immobilized and flooding uncontrollably, Lieutenant Commander Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. The Samuel B. Roberts ultimately capsized and sank around 10:05. Of the 224 personnel aboard, 89 were killed during the initial combat. Another 25 succumbed to injuries, exposure, or shark attacks over the following 2 days as survivors remained in open water. In total, 120 crew members survived, many sustaining serious physical wounds and enduring profound psychological trauma. Meanwhile, the destroyer escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond engaged the Japanese cruisers with their limited torpedo complement. Although no confirmed hits were recorded, these attacks created significant disruption in the enemy formation and, combined with extensive smokescreens, provided intermittent concealment for the vulnerable American carriers. Despite their relatively small size and limited armament, these ships succeeded in delaying the Japanese advance and inflicting material and psychological damage on the enemy, demonstrating a remarkable combination of sacrifice and daring. During the surface engagements, American carrier-based aircraft relentlessly attacked Japanese forces. Pilots faced an almost impossible scenario. Their planes were outfitted for ground strikes, not the heavily armored Japanese warships. Many of the Avenger bombers had already expended torpedoes in pre-dawn strikes against land targets. Wildcat fighters carried only machine guns effective against aircraft but inadequate against armored hulls. In some instances, pilots resorted to deploying depth charges, ordinarily anti-submarine weapons, against surface ships, knowing these were largely ineffective but hoping to cause disruption or draw enemy fire. Undeterred by these limitations, the aviators repeatedly pressed their attacks with extraordinary courage. Many were relatively inexperienced, with fewer than 200 flight hours, yet they executed low-level dives against battleships bristling with anti-aircraft defenses. When munitions were depleted, they performed unarmed dry runs to force enemy maneuvers and disrupt gunnery calculations, exerting a powerful psychological influence on Japanese commanders. Vice Admiral Kurita, observing the persistent aerial assaults, overestimated the size and capability of the American force, mistaking the small escort carriers for fleet carriers. The intensity and coordination of the attacks created the impression of a much larger, heavily armed opposition. As reinforcements from Taffy II joined the fight, Rear Admiral Felix Stump immediately directed squadrons to rearm with heavier ordnance. Avengers were loaded with Mark 13 torpedoes and 500-pound general-purpose bombs, representing the heaviest available munitions. Within 30 minutes of the initial distress call from Samuel B. Roberts, Taffy II launched a series of concentrated strikes. Over the course of the 90-minute engagement, these sorties, over 70 in total, targeted Kurita's force, achieving devastating results. Multiple Japanese heavy cruisers were sunk or severely damaged, impairing command and control across the fleet. At approximately 8:20, aircraft from Taffy struck the heavy cruiser Suzuya, causing a near-miss detonation in her starboard-forward torpedo mounts. The resulting chain reaction of Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, each loaded with 1,080 pounds of high-explosive, ripped large holes in the hull and ignited uncontrollable fires. Damage control efforts proved insufficient, and by early afternoon, the vessel was abandoned and sank around 13:20. Similarly, the heavy cruiser Chikuma, already compromised by gunfire from the Samuel B. Roberts, suffered multiple torpedo hits from Taffy II aircraft, leading to progressive flooding and eventual sinking. Survivors were rescued by the destroyer Noaki, which then returned to fleet operations. Chokai, immobilized by torpedo and bomb damage, was deliberately scuttled by accompanying Japanese destroyers to prevent capture. The escort carriers themselves became direct targets as Japanese warships closed the distance, despite persistent smokescreens and evasive maneuvers. The combined actions of destroyer escorts, small carriers, and determined pilots disrupted the Japanese offensive, inflicted significant losses, and bought crucial time for American forces, demonstrating that even under overwhelming odds, strategic impact could be achieved through coordination, audacity, and extraordinary bravery. Positioned on the left side of the carrier formation, USS Gambia Bay began to lag behind her sister ships as the pursuit unfolded. The strain on her engines, operating beyond their intended limits, made it impossible to keep pace with the rest of the group. Captain Walter V. Weg, nicknamed Bowser, due to his combative demeanor, observed with mounting frustration as the distance between Gambia Bay and the formation steadily widened. By 800 hours, the carrier was effectively alone, separated from the protective screen of the task unit. Shortly after, at 807, 3 Japanese heavy cruisers, Chikuma, Tone, and Hagoro, focused their fire on the vulnerable carrier from roughly 15,000 yards. The first 8-inch shells began to land on target. Within 3 minutes, Chikuma's shell struck the aft flight deck, igniting fires that quickly spread. Successive hits compounded the damage. At 8:20, a shell penetrated below the waterline near the forward engine compartment, triggering severe flooding. The impact ruptured internal bulkheads, allowing seawater to pour into the space. The forward engine room filled entirely, killing the majority of its crew, and Gambia Bay lost one of her engines. Her speed fell from 18 knots to 11, leaving her further behind and entirely exposed. USS Johnston, despite being heavily damaged herself, attempted to divert enemy fire away from Gambia Bay. From the command of the Fantail, Commander Evans ordered the carrier's remaining operational guns to engage the Japanese cruisers. Johnston's fire caused minor damage to Chikuma and Tone, forcing them to briefly redirect their attacks. However, with 3 enemy cruisers in close range, the carrier could not evade sustained bombardment for long. Gambia Bay was relentlessly pounded. Shells tore through her engine rooms, hangar deck, and hull, while flames engulfed much of the ship. By 840, the carrier was immobilized, listing sharply to port with fires raging throughout. 10 minutes later, Captain Vueg commanded the crew to abandon ship. Sailors entered the warm waters of the Philippine Sea, escaping a vessel rapidly succumbing to destruction. By 907, Gambier Bay had capsized to port. Her keel was briefly visible above the water, revealing the extent of shell damage beneath the surface, including a missing port propeller blasted away by one of the strikes. The carrier remained inverted for a mere 4 minutes before sinking entirely at 911. From the initial hit to her final descent beneath the waves, only 61 minutes had passed. Out of roughly 800 crew members, 147 were killed immediately, either by the bombardment or by drowning. Nearly 700 men entered the water, facing up to 50 hours adrift in shark-infested seas before rescue. Meanwhile, the other carriers endured severe punishment but remained afloat thanks to vigorous damage control, evasive maneuvers, smokescreens, and sacrificial efforts by their escorts. USS Kinnan Bay absorbed 15 hits from shells ranging between 5-inch and 14-inch calibers. One 14-inch armor-piercing shell from battleship Congo passed entirely through the vessel without detonating due to a malfunctioning delayed fuse. The projectile left 4-foot-wide holes on both sides but caused surprisingly little internal damage. Other impacts caused casualties, fires, and flooding, but the crew managed to contain the destruction and Kinnan Bay survived. USS White Plains also sustained multiple near misses and at least one direct hit. Her crew kept propulsion and steering functional despite the barrage. USS Samuel B, flagship of Admiral Sprague, successfully avoided more than 100 near misses through aggressive maneuvers personally directed from the flag bridge. Sprague's calm and precise commands over the radio maintained morale among Taffy 3's ships, while the carrier's single 5-inch stern guns engaged Japanese cruisers whenever they came within 18,000 yards, scoring minor hits that affected superstructures but could not critically damage armored vessels. Around 845, USS Johnston, now severely crippled, executed a final audacious charge. Surrounded by Japanese destroyers and facing a coordinated torpedo threat from the light cruiser Yahagi and 5 destroyers Isukazi, Yukazi, Urakazi, and Nawaki, Johnston advanced despite having just one functioning gun turret, a single engine barely capable of 10 knots, and steering managed manually by the crew. The maneuver was effectively a suicide mission understood by all aboard, but it was necessary to shield the remaining carriers from imminent destruction. The remaining forward gun aboard USS Johnston continued to fire relentlessly as her crew worked frantically to reload, managing to strike the Japanese cruiser Yahagi with several shells. Despite these efforts, Japanese destroyers rapidly closed in on Johnston, surrounding the ship and unleashing devastating gunfire at extremely close range. Shells from multiple 5-inch guns tore into the already heavily damaged destroyer from several angles, inflicting critical damage across the vessel. By 9:10 a.m., all of Johnston's weapons had been silenced, both engines were inoperative, and fires raged uncontrollably throughout the ship. The hull was severely listing due to extensive flooding, leaving the vessel on the brink of capsizing. Recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, Commander Ernest Evans issued the order to abandon ship. Crew members began leaping over the sides, entering the warm waters, and swimming as quickly as possible to distance themselves from the sinking warship. At 10:10 a.m., Johnston capsized onto her port side and sank swiftly. In a striking gesture of respect, sailors from the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze assembled on deck, standing at attention and saluting the sinking American destroyer. This act, recorded in numerous Japanese accounts, highlighted the extraordinary valor displayed by Johnston's crew, even in the eyes of their adversaries. Commander Evans was observed in the water, afloat in a life jacket, but he was never recovered. Of the ship's 327 personnel, only 141 survived. A total of 186 officers and men were lost, either killed during combat, drowned when the ship went down, or taken by sharks while awaiting rescue in the open sea. In recognition of his remarkable bravery, Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive the nation's highest award for valor. The official citation commended him for conspicuous gallantry and extraordinary leadership under fire, noting his decisive actions in protecting the lightly armed carriers under his command. Throughout the engagement, Johnston had been the first to lay down a smokescreen and to open fire as an enemy task force approached. Commander Evans conducted a daring torpedo assault despite the destroyer being under sustained enemy shell fire. For nearly 2.5 hours, Johnston engaged in continuous combat, and at 9:25 a.m., a remarkable turn of events occurred. Vice Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese fleet, found his operations disrupted by the relentless attacks of American destroyers, ongoing airstrikes, and confusion over the disposition of the opposing forces. Communications between his ships had broken down, and individual captains were acting independently, targeting the nearest American vessels rather than adhering to a unified strategy. Fearing that he faced the full might of the U.S. carrier task force, possibly supported by heavy battleships, Kurita ordered a general withdrawal to the north to regroup and consolidate his scattered units. Unbeknownst to him, the American forces were on the verge of annihilation. Most of the U.S. destroyers had been sunk or were sinking. The escorts had expended their torpedoes, were critically low on ammunition, and heavily damaged. The carriers were nearly depleted of both fuel and munitions, while Gambier Bay was sinking and other ships were significantly impaired. Had the Japanese fleet continued its assault for another half-hour, Taffy 3 would likely have been destroyed, leaving the landing forces at Leyte completely exposed to battleship bombardment. Historians still debate Kurita's decision. Some argue he lost his resolve after nearly being hit by torpedoes, others suggest he was too cautious to accept further casualties, and some assert that his withdrawal was a reasonable choice given the limited information available at the time. From the American viewpoint, however, the Japanese retreat was almost incomprehensible. On board USS Fanshawe Bay, a signalman near Admiral Sprigg shouted in disbelief, "God damn it, boys! They're getting away." Officers and sailors watched in astonishment as the formidable Japanese battleships and cruisers turned northward, retreating from the carriers they had nearly destroyed. Commander Spragg could hardly believe what had transpired. He had been fully convinced that his small task force would be utterly destroyed in the encounter. Days later, his after-action report conveyed a sense of astonishment at the outcome, emphasizing the extraordinary nature of Taffy 3's survival. Spragg noted that even Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz later acknowledged the improbable success of the engagement, remarking that the persistence of the American ships defied conventional tactical reasoning. Despite this miraculous turn, there was no opportunity for celebration. By 1050 hours, as Taffy 3 regrouped following the surface engagement and worked to rescue sailors who had been thrown into the sea, a new threat emerged. 5 Japanese aircraft appeared on the western horizon at very low altitude, gradually ascending to around 2,500 feet before diving steeply toward the American carriers. These attacks were unprecedented. The pilots intended to crash their aircraft directly into the ships, marking the first organized deployment of the kamikaze special attack units. The first plane, a Mitsubishi A6M0, struck the port side of USS Kitkun Bay near the waterline. Its bomb detonated on impact, creating a breach in the hull and triggering flooding, though the carrier remained operational thanks to efficient damage control. Another kamikaze targeted USS White Plains but was intercepted by concentrated anti-aircraft fire, exploding mid-air and scattering debris onto the ship without causing critical damage. USS St. Lo, however, was not so fortunate. At 1053, a Zero piloted by Lieutenant Yukioki penetrated intense anti-aircraft defenses and smashed through St. Lo's wooden flight deck near the centerline. The aircraft's 250-kilogram bomb ignited aviation fuel and armed ordnance in the hangar, producing secondary explosions that spread rapidly. Within minutes, the ship was engulfed in flames from bow to stern, and despite heroic efforts by damage control teams, the fire could not be contained. At 1125, Captain Francis McKenna ordered the crew to abandon ship. Moments later, St. Lo erupted in a massive fireball and sank completely, becoming the first major American vessel lost to a kamikaze strike. The psychological impact of this new form of warfare would resonate with U.S. sailors for the remainder of the conflict. By the end of the battle, Taffy 3 had survived, but the cost was devastating. 4 destroyers and escorts, USS Johnston, USS Hoel, USS Samuel B. Roberts, and USS Gambier Bay, were sunk during surface combat, and St. Lo was destroyed by the kamikaze attack. Numerous other ships sustained varying degrees of damage. American casualties totaled 1,161 killed or missing, with an additional 913 wounded. Many sailors spent up to 50 hours adrift in the tropical waters of the Philippine Sea before rescue, suffering from exposure, injuries, dehydration, or shark attacks. Survivors frequently reported seeing sharks circling throughout their ordeal, and some men vanished, dragged beneath the surface, while others succumbed to wounds that might have been survivable under prompt medical attention. Despite these severe losses, Taffy 3 achieved its strategic objective. The invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf remained secure, allowing General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 troops to continue landing without interference from enemy naval fire. The Japanese Central Force, despite overwhelming numbers and superior firepower, failed to reach its target. Admiral Kurita's ships lingered off Samar for several hours, attempting to regroup and assess the battle's toll. The fleet repeatedly altered course from north to west, southwest, and back north before ultimately withdrawing. By approximately 1,310 hours, it became evident to American observers that Kurita was retreating permanently from Leyte Gulf, moving through the San Bernardino Strait and heading west toward Brunei under pursuit. U.S. carrier-based aircraft harassed the retreating Japanese fleet throughout the afternoon and evening. The light cruiser Noshiro was sunk, while the destroyer Hayashimo sustained heavy damage and was deliberately run aground off Samar, later destroyed. The destroyer Noaki, carrying survivors from the heavy cruiser Chikuma, encountered American cruisers USS Vincennes, USS Miami, and USS Boise during the night transit through San Bernardino Strait. Heavily damaged by gunfire and ultimately finished off by torpedo attacks from USS Owen, Noaki's loss marked another consequence of the relentless American counterattacks. Taffy 3's ordeal at Samar, combining fierce surface combats and the unprecedented kamikaze threat, stands as a stark testament to the courage and resilience of the sailors involved. Their ability to endure and achieve their mission, despite overwhelming odds and catastrophic losses, exemplifies one of the most extraordinary naval actions of World War II. The vessel Noaki went down with all hands aboard, including survivors from the Chikuma, resulting in the loss of over 1,200 men. When considered in its entirety, the Battle of Leyte Gulf ranks as the largest naval confrontation in history in terms of the combined tonnage of participating ships, the geographic scope of operations, and the strategic consequences that followed. More than 200,000 military personnel took part, spread across a combat zone covering roughly 100,000 square miles of ocean. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed nearly every operational warship remaining in its fleet, while the United States deployed significant forces from both the 3rd and 7th Fleets. The conflict unfolded as 4 distinct but interrelated engagements over 4 days, spanning an area of roughly 500 miles of open sea. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th witnessed American carrier-based aircraft sinking the Japanese battleship Musashi. That night, from October 24th to 25, the Battle of Surigao Strait marked the final historic clash between battleships as American battleships decimated the Japanese Southern Force. On October 25, the battle off Cape Engano saw Admiral Halsey's carriers destroy all 4 of Vice Admiral Ozawa's carriers. Concurrently, in the morning of October 25, the Battle of Samar highlighted Taffy 3's desperate resistance against the Japanese center force. Japanese losses were severe. 26 warships, totaling approximately 306,000 tons of displacement, were sunk. This included 3 battleships, Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea and Yamashiro and Fuso at Surigao Strait, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda at Cape Engano, 10 cruisers, 3 at Samar, and 9 destroyers. More than 10,500 Japanese sailors were killed over the 4-day campaign. The Imperial Japanese Navy was effectively crippled. Fuel shortages, damage to surviving vessels, and the loss of trained personnel relegated it to a defensive posture, unable to conduct offensive operations on a strategic scale again. American losses, by contrast, were comparatively light. 6 ships, totaling 37,000 tons, were sunk. The light carrier USS Princeton fell to a Japanese airstrike on October 24, while 2 escort carriers, USS Gambier Bay and USS St. Lo, 2 destroyers, USS Johnston and USS Hoel, and 1 destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, were lost during the Battle of Samar. Total American casualties numbered 2,830 dead and 913 wounded. The overall outcome was a decisive strategic triumph for the United States, with Japan's gamble in Operation Shore Go ending in catastrophic failure. Among the engagements, the Battle of Samar is particularly remarkable. The engagement is frequently cited in naval history for the sheer improbability of its result. Taffy 3, with 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, faced the center force, which consisted of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The tonnage disparity favored the Japanese roughly 10-1, and their gunpowder was vastly superior. Yamato's main battery alone could launch more ordnance in a single salvo than Taffy 3 could fire in 5 minutes. Against these overwhelming odds, the smaller American force not only survived but compelled the larger Japanese fleet to retreat without completing its mission. The improbable victory was the result of multiple interlocking factors. First, aggressive torpedo attacks by American destroyers fractured Japanese formations at a critical moment. Kurita's ships had approached in formations optimized for fuel efficiency and mutual support, not combat. The sudden need for evasive maneuvers forced individual captains to act independently, creating disarray. This disruption prevented the Japanese from concentrating their fire effectively, as ships obstructed one another's lines of attack. Communications faltered under the flood of conflicting reports, and commanders lost situational awareness. Smoke screens deployed by American vessels further reduced visibility, compromising Japanese optical fire control systems. Second, radar-directed American gunnery provided a crucial advantage under the adverse conditions of Samar. Mark 37 fire control directors, linked to Mark 1A computers, allowed U.S. destroyers to maintain accurate targeting through smoke, rain, and rapid maneuvers. USS Johnston, Hoel, and Herman repeatedly struck Japanese ships under conditions that rendered Japanese optical targeting largely ineffective. The Japanese reliance on visual range-finding, while sophisticated under ideal circumstances, was severely hindered by the weather and smoke, giving Americans a decisive technological edge. Finally, superior American damage control practices ensured ships remained combat-capable despite critical hits. USS Johnston continued to engage for over 2 hours even after losing half of her propulsion, multiple gun mounts, and sustaining extensive flooding. USS Keenan Bay withstood 15 shell hits, including one from a 14-inch projectile that passed entirely through the hull. American crews had been rigorously trained in damage control, and the ship design's compartmentalization further enabled prolonged operational effectiveness, directly contributing to the successful defense. In sum, the Battle of Leyte Gulf demonstrated the interplay of strategy, technology, and human determination. While Japanese forces had superior numbers and firepower, coordination breakdowns, innovative American tactics, technological advantages, and disciplined damage control ensured that even against overwhelming odds, the outcome decisively favored the United States, reshaping naval power in the Pacific for the remainder of World War II. Japanese efforts at damage control were generally less effective than their American counterparts, a result of contrasting naval design priorities and training practices. Japanese warships had been engineered with a strong focus on offensive capabilities, favoring heavy armament and firepower over structural resilience and onboard damage mitigation systems. In addition, Japanese crews received comparatively limited instruction in damage control procedures. Consequently, when American destroyers engaged Japanese cruisers, the inflicted harm was often more catastrophic than similar strikes against U.S. vessels, exposing a critical vulnerability in Japanese ship survivability. Another factor reducing the destructive impact of Japanese gunfire on U.S. ships was the nature of their armor-piercing ammunition. Designed specifically to breach the thick armor of battleships, these shells frequently overpenetrated the much thinner hulls of American destroyers and escort carriers. Constructed with delayed action fuses that activated after passing through multiple inches of steel, the shells were devastating against heavily armored targets but often passed entirely through lightly built vessels before exploding. Had the Japanese utilized high-explosive shells with instant fuses optimized for unarmored ships, the consequences for the Americans would have been far more severe, producing massive breaches and catastrophic internal damage with each hit. The relative ineffectiveness of many Japanese rounds was, in fact, a fortuitous circumstance for the US forces. American aerial assaults imposed sustained pressure on Japanese ships throughout the engagement, forcing continuous maneuvering and disrupting their ability to focus on surface targets. Even after exhausting their ordnance, American pilots executed dry runs, flying attack patterns without releasing bombs or torpedoes, compelling Japanese ships to alter course and thereby spoiling their firing solutions. This unrelenting aerial harassment, combined with Admiral Kurita's apprehension about encountering stronger American units, played a crucial role in his eventual decision to retreat. Japanese anti-aircraft fire, while intense, did not decisively halt American aircraft, which pressed their attacks with remarkable persistence despite suffering losses. The decisive element behind Taffy 3's survival and eventual success, however, was the extraordinary valor and bold tactical initiative of the U.S. crews. Actions such as Commander Ernest Evans' unauthorized charge against the Yamato demonstrated an instinctive understanding that aggressive engagement was the only feasible path to survival. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland led Samuel B. Roberts directly into a confrontation with heavy cruisers, fully aware that the odds of escape were negligible but recognizing that offensive action was imperative. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague directed his destroyers to execute high-risk torpedo attacks designed to delay Japanese progress, even momentarily, to protect the carriers. These maneuvers were not calculated from positions of strength, but arose from necessity and were carried out with such determination that they created the illusion of confronting a far more formidable force than was actually present. The Japanese, trained under Mahanian doctrines emphasizing decisive engagements between battleships, expected adversaries to preserve their strength and retreat when overmatched. The relentless close-range assaults by U.S. destroyers directly contradicted every tactical assumption in the Japanese framework, attacking with complete audacity and continuing the fight until their vessels were literally sunk beneath them. The American crew's refusal to follow conventional expectations of a weaker force introduced chaos and uncertainty into the Japanese command's decision-making, contributing decisively to the withdrawal of their superior fleet. The events surrounding the battle caused significant confusion and misperceptions, leading Admiral Kurita to overestimate the size of the opposing force. In the immediate aftermath, the remarkable bravery of Taffy 3 was widely acknowledged. The entire unit received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors awarded to military units in the United States. The official citation highlighted the extraordinary courage displayed while confronting heavily armed Japanese fleet units. It specifically noted that 2 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort advanced directly at battleships, firing their final torpedoes in a desperate defense of the task group, ultimately being destroyed under intense enemy fire after 2.5 hours of relentless combat. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his pivotal role. His citation recognized him as the first to lay down a smokescreen and open fire, launching the initial torpedo attack as USS Johnston came under fire from Japanese shells. The award emphasized that Evans' unyielding fighting spirit during the engagement should serve as an enduring source of inspiration for those who served alongside him. In 2023, more than 8 decades after his death, Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro formally confirmed that Evans was the first Native American to receive the Medal of Honor in the history of the U.S. Navy. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland earned the Navy Cross for his leadership aboard Samuel B. Roberts. Commander Leon S. Kintberger of USS Hoel received a posthumous Navy Cross, and Commander Amos T. Howey of USS Heermann was also awarded the Navy Cross for his ship's aggressive actions. Numerous other officers and sailors were recognized with silver and bronze stars. While some historians contend that additional medals of honor should have been granted, political considerations at the time prevented further awards. The battle itself was partly the result of a severe communication breakdown between Admiral Halsey and Admiral Kincaid. Both the 3rd and 7th Fleets were reluctant to draw attention to an engagement that exposed significant command and coordination issues at the highest levels. The human cost of the engagement was immense despite its short duration. USS Johnston, with a crew of 327, lost 186 men. USS Hoel's crew of 273 suffered 187 fatalities. Samuel B. Roberts, with 224 aboard, lost 89 during combat and an additional 25 succumbed to injuries or exposure afterward. Gambia Bay, with roughly 800 crew members, saw 147 killed immediately, with further losses occurring later. In total, Taffy 3 endured more than 1,100 deaths out of around 3,500 personnel. Survivors faced extreme conditions in the water for up to 50 hours before being rescued. Exposure to the tropical sun caused severe dehydration, while injuries attracted sharks. Sailors witnessed the weakening and loss of their comrades, leading to profound and long-lasting psychological trauma, including survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress. Nonetheless, survival rates were relatively high given the intensity of the ship sinkings. This was largely due to thorough training in emergency abandonment procedures and the availability of life-saving equipment. American vessels were equipped with sufficient life rafts and personal flotation devices, and crews regularly practiced survival drills. When ordered to abandon ship, personnel executed the commands efficiently despite fires, flooding, and battle damage. The Navy's focus on survival training, often dismissed as bureaucratic, directly contributed to saving hundreds of lives off Samar. The wreckage of the ships remained undiscovered for decades due to the extraordinary depth of the Philippine Trench where the battle took place. This area contains some of the deepest waters in the world, exceeding 20,000 feet, where Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambia Bay sank. Technological limitations prevented exploration until recently. In March 2021, explorer Victor Vescovo located USS Johnston at 21,180 feet using the deep submersible limiting factor. The vessel rests largely intact on a steep undersea slope, showing bridge damage from 6.1-inch shells that claimed Commander Evans and much of his crew, as well as catastrophic stern damage from Yamato's 18.1-inch guns. Johnston's discovery established it as the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed by a manned submersible, a record held for 15 months. In June 2022, Vescovo's team found USS Samuel B. Roberts at 22,621 feet, setting a new depth record for shipwrecks. The destroyer escort lies in two main sections, the forward portion upright on the seabed, and the aft section lying on its side about 10 meters away, split at the point where an 8-inch shell destroyed the engine room. Both sites are protected under the Sunken Military Craft Act, serving as war graves and remaining undisturbed due to their remote locations and extreme depths. The Battle of Samar remains an enduring example of exceptional naval courage and commitment. When lightly armed destroyers charged full speed against battleships, they created a defining moment in naval history, demonstrating what can be accomplished through determination, sacrifice, and refusal to accept defeat even when victory seems impossible. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz famously described Taffy 3's success as nothing short of divine intervention. Samuel Eliot Morrison, the official historian of U.S. naval operations in World War II, echoed this sentiment, noting that no engagement in U.S. Navy history exhibited more bravery, grit, and resourcefulness than those critical hours off Samar.